Hello, everybody. Welcome to BeerSmith Podcast number 42. Got a great show for you today. We're going to talk about sour beer brewing. I want to mention again, BeerSmithRecipes.com is out, which is our new website for sharing recipes, as well as BeerSmith 2.1, which is the software that goes along with that. They're tightly integrated, so it makes it really easy to share recipes across machines or with your friends across the internet. Also want to mention I've been working really hard to improve the audio quality of the show. We had some challenges the last few weeks with some of the guests, and so I've been working that really hard, and I think I've got a much better quality audio show going forward. And also our video show, if you haven't seen it on YouTube, we have all of the podcasts available on YouTube now as well. If you go to beersmith.com/blog, you can see the latest shows listed with the video for them. And now, without further ado, let's jump right into this week's interview. Today on the show, my guest is Mike Mraz. He started homebrewing in 2006. By 2008, he was actually California Homebrewer of the Year. Again in 2009. He won the Maltose Falcons Best of Show Award in 2008, 2012. Third place at Pale Ale, the Pale Ale category at the National Homebrewing Awards this year. And he's a regular guest on the Can You Brew It show. Mike, it's great to have you on the show.
It's good to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you being here. We're gonna talk a little bit about sour beer brewing today, and a style that I actually enjoy, but a lot of homebrewers are not necessarily familiar with unless they've been around for a little while.
Did it on accident.
Yeah. But it is a unique style. It's really great. In fact, there was some great one. You just came back. I know we both were at the National Homebrew Conference. Really some great sour beers there.
Yeah, that's what's so great about going to those things is you get to taste all kinds of good stuff, and everybody brings out their special stuff. So it's loved to hang out with good friends and have some good beer. So
yeah,
it's nice.
Another fantastic event out there in Seattle. But I was wondering if you could just share with us a little bit about some of the styles that are categorized as sour beers, and maybe talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, I'll just go down the list. If you're a beer guy, it's category 17. You got the Berliner Weiss, and if you want to know a little bit about that style, I don't make one. I got a few friends that do. It's kind of a light, probably the lowest alcohol sour beer, but there was a talk on it this past NHC, so if you're a member of the National Homebrew Association, look that up, and there's a lot of good information on that. Next one's Flanders Red. That's a special style that I really like. I just won currently the Best of Show for the Maltose Falcons with that beer, and actually made it into the second round, but I didn't get anything for that one. Then you got the Flanders Brown Ale or an Old Bruin. And then you get to the really good ones, the straight Lambics and the goose, and then the fruit Lambics is in that category is wide open. So,
and those get more exotic and harder to make, right?
Yeah. I had some really good. I got a friend, Chris Wolowski, that makes an amazing fruit Lambic. He did a blueberry one. It was almost had a wine character to it, really good, and the peach one was phenomenal. The aroma was just amazing, and I don't make that many of those because they take a long time to do, but the people who do really make good ones.
In some cases, you're talking years, right?
Oh yeah, just years to make the beer, and then you put it on fruit. They're just
really
and
cool.
What's great, yeah, they're pretty much amazing. Yeah.
Well, I know you make sour beer in a lot of different ways, and so I was wondering if you could just, at a high level, walk us through what some of the methods are for making sours.
Yeah. I'll talk a little bit how I do it. That was probably the easiest because that's obviously I can relate to that. And then we can go and talk a little bit about maybe like what Cantillon does. That's kind of the benchmark for the official. That's the beer if you want to try and clone a straight Lambic or a goose, that would be the one. So pretty much how I do it is you pretty much start out with a regular beer. So maybe something a little malty. You can even do something similar to like a Bière de Garde or like a Belgian Pale Ale. You don't even necessarily have to use a Belgian yeast. So it's just got a little bit of character and a little bit of flavor. Keep the hops a little bit low, around 15, 20 IBUs. And that's kind of my base sour beer. And then you can add some organisms to that. We can talk about how to do that and which ones do that. But the malt bill is pretty simple, and I don't do much in the way of like a sour mash. I've been reading a little bit more about that, I've done a few, but that's not normally my way that I do it. It's pretty much a beer to start with, and then once it's finished out, I'll rack it into another carboy or a keg or a barrel, depending on how much I have in the vessel that I'm using, and then add the bugs, as they're called. And then you obviously have Brettanomyces. I think a lot of people are familiar with that one. You have Lactobacillus, which is, think of like a clean sour, like a lemonade sour. Then you have Pediococcus, which adds a little bit of cherry notes to it, and then it starts to get funky with some of the other stuff that goes on too.
Well, let's talk. Maybe talk first a little bit about Brett and what that flavor adds to the beer.
Okay, I've made a few 100% Brett beers, and those are coming more and more popular.
So
but you got to
actually you actually don't go through a conventional fermentation in that case.
No, it'd be all Brett. Brett's a wild yeast, so it does ferment out like a regular yeast. It gives different characters, so we'll just call it interesting. And I fine-tuned my 100% Brett beers. I don't really want to call them sour, but because it takes so long. I have ones that are 3 years old, and they do have a little bit of acidity note to them, but sometimes not necessarily in a good way. I've become more and more, I think, Brettanomyces is good for a secondary fermentation.
Right.
And the reason why I'm saying that is I've had some good 100% Brett beers, but you're missing some mouthfeel. And I was talking to a few people this past weekend, and there's some sort of compounds, it slips off the top of my head, the names of them, that in brewer's yeast and obviously wine yeast, there's chemical compounds that give you that mouthfeel in the yeast. And I think Brett is missing some of that. So I always say when I taste one of these 100% Brettanomyces beer, that it becomes almost one-dimensional. It's missing something, and you just can't quite put your finger on it. So they're good. They're interesting, but they're not what I would consider a great beer. So, and that's just my taste. So, but I'm still working on it. So maybe someday that, I found the right combination of, Brett yeast, and it's usually a few different blends, and then, all malt too. So you're trying to build a little bit of residual sugar and some flavors. I started out with most of my Brett beers were mostly like wheat and Pilsner malts. Now I've moved into adding some Munich and some aromatic and some dark malts to try and help that mouthfeel. So it's an ongoing process, just like everything else. So,
but a standard sour beer, you're going to make basically a regular ale, right?
That would, the easiest way is the easiest way is to take a beer that you already have. Maybe it didn't finish out. That's probably the best thing to do is take a beer that hasn't finished out and rack it over to another keg or a carboy.
Right.
Put some oak chips in it, or put some cherries or fruit or blueberries if you want it. You don't have to do that if you don't want. And then go buy a bottle of, it could be Jolly Pumpkin. It could be, Russian River, Lost Abbey, even, Cantillon, Hanson's. Any one of those would have enough organisms in there to get started. It might take 6 months, a year to start getting some flavors, but it'll work, especially with the beers that don't finish out. And that's kind of where I started. Had a Belgian Pale Ale that didn't quite taste good. It was still a little sweet. Put it in a bucket and let it go with a couple sour beers from Russian River, and it turned out pretty good.
So when do you pitch the beer? I mean, when do you pitch the yeast? Then let's say you make a regular beer, something fairly mild. How long after you start fermentation do you look at pitching the Brett, for example?
I would say if you're in all intents and purposes to make 100%, a sour beer in general. So, put it like about a 1055, 1050 beer. That's a low enough alcohol, so most of the organisms will still work. You could make bigger ones, but that's a nice, easy medium to start with. Hop additions right around 15, 20 IBUs on the low side. And then once it gets down to like 10, 20, go ahead and rack it off the yeast. You kind of want to shock the fermentation so it kind of slows down and maybe even stops at that point. You get it off the main bed of yeast. There's still going to be enough in suspension that it continues to go, but it slows it down so it won't finish all the way out.
So, I mean, that could only be a week after you start fermentation maybe or something like that, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So
or you can crash cool it or if you have those ability to crash cool it, you can do that too. Or I just rack it off.
Okay. And then you pitch the yeast, and then, or I'm sorry, you pitch the, well, it's a yeast. You pitch the Brett, right? And you let it go for how long? How do you know when the Brett's done? I know it can take quite a long time.
Some people wait till the pellicle stops because Brett forms a pellicle on top of the beer. So usually a white.
Talk about what a pellicle is, just so everybody knows.
A pellicle, pretty much looks like a white film, almost really thin Saran wrap with some yeast kind of like pretty much powdery mildew on top of the Saran wrap. And what the Brettanomyces is building a protection layer so it does its work. I don't know exactly the reason why or the scientific behind it, but I know that's what it does. So,
okay. So how long do you let it go then? When do you know it's done?
It's usually by taste, but I don't mess with them for 6 months.
Wow.
And there's ones that I didn't mess with for 2 years. You just if you kind of know what you're building, if you want something really sour, just let them go. And one of the main things I can say is, in any brewing process, after fermentation, you want to limit any way to stop introducing oxygen. Because we're familiar with the cardboard flavors and the sherry flavors and all those bad things that are associated with oxygen after fermentation. Sour beers are the same way. I like to limit my oxygen content as much as possible, even during the length of time, because it produces different flavors. Some not so good. We talked about Lactobacillus has that nice, clean sour, like a lemonade tart.
Right.
I like more of that. I don't like the acetic sour, which is the real, harder sour, kind of in the back of your throat kind of sour. So if you have more oxygen, you're going to make more acetic acid, and less oxygen, you're going to have more of a lactic style, a little bit cleaner. So think about that too in the vessels you use. I'll usually rack it over to a carboy. So we talked about, maybe a week into fermentation, even a bucket or carboy, whatever you use, and then rack it over to another carboy at that point. And then when it gets about 10, 20, it's kind of hard to measure that sometimes. Just let it go for a week. Just about when fermentation starts to slow down, most of the yeast drop out. That's a good visual sign to do that. And then pitch, you can go and get the Roeselare blend from Y Yeast. That's a very nice blend of yeast. Or you can pick and choose, maybe 2 forms of Brett. And then
you can get you can get them from the major yeast producers as well. Yeah. Obviously, Y Yeast, White Labs, etc.
I'll make a side note here. Lactobacillus does not like to work in the presence of hops. So
let's talk for a minute about that. We talked about Brett. Let's go on to Lactobacillus. Now, Lactobacillus is not the same stuff, right?
No, that's more of obviously that's an organism or a bacteria.
It's a bacteria, I believe.
Yeah, bread is officially
a yeast, right?
Wild yeast. It's just not a brewer's yeast. I don't know so they call it a wild yeast. So it's becoming more and more a brewer's yeast. But so Lactobacillus is actually a bacteria, and that produces that lactic acid that you see in a Berliner Weiss. There's different kind of yogurts that use it, so it gives it that tang. I think it might be in sourdough bread too. So gives it that lemonade kind of tang. That's the typical sour that we're normally used to tasting. But it doesn't like to work in the presence of hops. There's some holding there. So
how do you get around that?
Keep your hop additions on the low side. Yeah. So keep them. That's why I said 15, 20s. That's even pushing it actually.
15 IBUs. Are you talking about 15 IBUs?
Yeah. Some of the Berliner Weisses are hopped around 5 IBUs.
Wow.
Yeah.
Pretty low.
Yeah. But all their souring comes from Lactobacillus. So that's their main thing.
So do you use it in the same way you would the Brett, or do you add it in a different way?
Pretty much the same way. The easiest way is just to pitch them all at the same time, and then just let them go. There's other breweries, professional side, that'll pitch the Brett first, let it go for a little while, and then pitch all the lacto and PDO and the other stuff that goes maybe anywhere a couple weeks to a couple months after. Back to the Berliner Weiss, they pitched it was the Lactobacillus. One of the breweries that did that. It was a full week. They pitched it and let it sit for a full week before they added the brewer's yeast at that point. So it sat for a full week on the Lactobacillus, and that beer was very tart. Yeah. little too tart, actually, I thought, for the balance. But, like I said, there's a style for everybody. That's not my favorite style, but it's funny, I'm a huge sour guy, and the Berliner Ice is just not my, I don't know, maybe it's the one-dimensional, and then the sourness is different. So
are they primarily using Lactobacillus then? They're not really using Brett? I mean, you mentioned mixing the two.
They do. That's just
aren't a lot of the Belgians made primarily with Brett?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
the Berliner Weiss is more of a German-style sour.
Right.
So at least how everybody does it a little different. You talk about the traditional way, and then you talk about trying to make the traditional way consistent. And I think they came up with pitch a lacto first for a week, then pitch a brewer's yeast, like a German ale yeast, and then at bottle conditioning, you can pitch the Brett. So you get 3 different yeasts, 3 different times, different characters for each. If you wanted to be lazy, you can pitch the Brett and the brewer's yeast if you want a little bit more funk at the same time.
Now you mentioned PDO and a few others. What are some of the other bugs you can possibly add to your beer?
Well, they call them the house strains at that point. I'm not quite sure. It's other yeast. There's, floral in the air. You taste some sour beers and they just taste a little bit different. It's just the natural aroma that in the wild yeast that falls into the kettle.
Spontaneous fermentation.
So,
I guess that's another option. You could open it up and do a spontaneous, right?
But if you do want to try that, I recommend doing it in the spring and late fall. Just before freezing and just after freezing. So when the nights get cool, like 40, 45-ish, you get the summer days that stay nice at 90 degrees, you're going to get some really funky stuff. So you want it to stay cool. It's just because for some reason those are the yeast that seem to strive, and they seem to have a little better floral, I think, because you get them too hot, it's just weird things happen.
Now, Lactobacillus and the others, do they take as long as a Brett? Do they take 6 months plus to finish?
PDO does. Lacto just kind of does its thing in a slow pace. It's souring along. It finishes. They talk about acidity levels and pH levels. I want to think 3.2 sounds about somewhere where Lactobacillus. I mean, things could go all over the place. Yeah. So,
but still, are you talking 6 months or more, perhaps?
Depending on how much you pitch, but
yeah.
I like to go before. If I make one 6 months, my point is like, well, at that point, do I rack it into a keg? And what's nice about a keg is you can taste it. It's you could just put CO2 on it and pull it off the keg. Does it have enough oak? Is the sourness turning right? Do I need to do anything?
Unlike a regular yeast, these aren't producing large amounts of CO2 or anything, right?
No, and a little carbonation is okay. Yeah. The Brett's going to do the most.
Obviously, because it's a regular brewer's yeast.
Yeah, it's just going to keep chugging away. So at that point, you can just kind of pull off the CO2, so it degas it, or you can just let it carbonate.
So it's perfectly viable to go ahead and once you're done, let's say you let it sit in the secondary for a couple of weeks, and then move it over a keg and leave it there for months or years.
Yeah. Even. Yeah, I'd tell people don't touch it for 6 months, and then after that, it's fair game. People, it's like, well, I didn't make past 8 months because I kept tasting it, and well, I guess it was good because you kept going back to it. So,
the beers are so acidic they're not going to spoil either, right? I mean, they're going to stay for a long time.
Technically, you just spoiled them anyway. You already did, and
now
you're waiting for them to turn. And I challenge somebody, if you do make one and you taste it after 6 months, like, it's missing some and doesn't taste good, put it away. Wait another 6 months.
Yeah.
Things change. The PDO's working through it. The Brett's changing. Brett, once it starts doing its thing, I like using Brett for the aromatic properties. I'm a big wine guy too. So when everybody sniffs beer now, and and you sniff wine, you kind of pulling those flavors out. Brettanomyces does that. It gives it some wonderful flavors. You got the barnyard and the apple and the floral flavors that it brings out. Just makes that puts another dimension on the beer that makes it that much special. So
what are your thoughts on finishing a beer made with Brett or lacto? How do you go about finishing it out?
You mean like an Orval sort of style? If you did a regular beer and then, are you talking about?
No, I'm just talking about finishing a regular sour beer. Is there anything special you need to do? You just keg it and drink it?
Pretty much keg it and drink it.
Okay.
Yeah. If you want to bottle condition it, you can do that. I used to use a wine yeast for just because I think it adds an additional character to it, and the wine yeast gives a little bit more aromatic and floral properties than a brewer's yeast.
Well, I had some notes down here about talking about bottle conditioning. I know you've done quite a bit of bottle conditioning. What do you recommend for bottle conditioning? Are you gonna let's say you keg the beer, you keep it there for 6 months or more. You finally decide it's ready. How do you go about bottling it?
At that point, you kind of figure if you put it in a carboy or keg and you degas it, if you kind of just got to know if there's any residual CO2 in there, or if you have a flat beer. So then you got to do the calculation, figure out how much sugar you want to put back in it, and pretty much go from there. And then you can use a champagne yeast, a white wine, a red wine, depending on. I kind of go to the beer store or wine store at the time, and you kind of just look down the list. It's like, okay, do I want more, berry? Because they tell you the descriptors of the wine just like they do beer yeast. It'll tell you it's an English ale, it's a little more fruity, or it's an American ale, it's a little clean. Obviously lagers and stuff. So they have the same descriptors in wine. So you kind of look for something if you're trying to accentuate something.
Obviously, you need to pitch enough yeast and enough sugar to carbonate it, though, right?
Yeah,
it's not going to carbonate by itself.
No, because most of it's by then the Brett's ate up a lot of the residual sugar, so there's not much left.
Right.
Unless you've made a really big beer and there's still, I don't know if it's going to wait that long for it to carbonate in the bottle. So I just recommend to just figure out what it's going to take to do, 3.5 volumes. That's a nice, good number there with a decent, 3 to 3.5. I usually have the Belgian bottles with a cork and cage. So I go anywhere from, 3.5 to 4 on the higher end, just because I like it brings out those aromatic properties and is sparkling and it shoots the cork across the room. That's always nice.
Is there any advantages to bottle conditioning, really, from a sour beer perspective?
I think it adds another dimension. If you use another yeast, like if you, for instance, use a wine yeast that has some of those little different characters, side by side, you can tell there's something different. You can't put your finger on it, but so yes, it does add something, but no, it's not mandatory. But it does take longer to go through bottle conditioning than it would, say, a regular ale. Because once you reintroduce sugar into the sour beer, the PDO goes back to work and the beer goes through a phase that gets pretty nasty. It's called the beer gets sick. And it doesn't happen all the time. It gets really thick and stringy. It tastes like, I don't know, like Play-Doh or silly putty. It's got this really weird consistency.
How does that happen? What causes it?
It's something to do with a pediococcus. There's certain strains of it that the beer goes sick. Vinny from Russian River talked about it in a presentation, and I go, I didn't know what it was, and I thought it was kind of strange. And once he talked about it, I go, that's it. That's exactly what it was what the beer did. But it takes so you might make a sour beer and pitch a bottle of Cantillon or Hansen's or Russian River or something. You get like 2 months into it and you taste it, and it's like it doesn't even pour out of the cup. It's so thick and gross. Then you dump it, and so no, it cleans up. So it. So
does it get better?
Yeah, it gets. I guess it gets well.
Oh, really?
So it takes a while. It usually take a couple weeks. Yeah,
but that doesn't always happen, huh?
Doesn't always. Every strain's
a little different.
Working with
wild yeast and wild bacteria.
But once your strain does go sick, they say it'll do that every time. I don't know much about it. I'm sure there's more and more people that are more knowledgeable, but I've had that happen.
If you get that point, do you wait it out, or you
just wait.
Just wait.
So when you do so back to bottle condition. So if you do bottle condition, don't be afraid. After 3 weeks and you think it's carbonated, you open one up and it's horrible. Just go ahead and stick them back and wait. Another 3 weeks. They'll come around. And one thing nice about bottle condition is you got them all sitting there. You can leave them warm. Just leave them in the cupboard. You don't have to keep them in the fridge, and they'll keep changing and getting better. So the damage is done. The beer's going to be, sour, and so you don't have to worry about them staying clean. So they change over time. I usually have a shelf full of different ones, and when I'm ready for one, I'll stick it in the fridge, and a couple of days I'll take it out, and they age just like a bottle of wine. Yeah, and they're much cheaper to make at home than they are at the store, believe me.
Oh, yeah. These are fairly expensive to buy.
Yeah.
Because of the time involved, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, another method is to make a sour mash. I know it's not your area of expertise, but maybe you could just talk for a few minutes about what a sour mash does, how you make a sour mash, and then how it makes sour beer.
Yeah. On the grain has lactobacillus on it and some other organisms.
Naturally occurring, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So how you make a sour mash is you just regularly make a mash, and you just let it sit. Most people let them sit 24 hours. I think I've heard of people letting them sit 48 hours. Mm-hmm. So that's a long time, and they get a lot of weird, funky barnyard flavors.
So it gets sour right there.
Yeah, and then and I think in the professional side it works out really well because it's sour there. Then you transfer to the boil kettle, and everything else stays the same.
Right.
Because then you've killed everything.
Well, plus the time involved too.
Yeah,
and time is money when you're a business, right? You
got it. So everything else can stay the same, and they don't have to worry about worrying about up their lines with bacteria and their the fermentation schedules and tanks and all that. So that's one way to do it. So, and I've had hit or miss beers. The problem is sometimes they're inconsistent. Mm-hmm. Some people can cheat by adding just pure lactic acid to their beers. Also, we kind of calls it cheating, but. If it is what it is, I understand your dilemma, especially if you're a professional. And if that's you like that really clean sour, that's fine too. I've made just a Belgian wit beer, a nice light one. Mm-hmm. I guess like a small Berliner Weiss, but I didn't want them too sour, so I add a little bit of lactic acid. Just you can buy it at the store for,
sure.
And it's kind of like a nice, light, refreshing lemonade beer. It works really well. So those are options to do.
You glossed over one point, but I wanted to bring it out. Yeah. You mentioned polluting the equipment, and I know a lot of people keep two sets of equipment. Do you recommend that?
To some extent, yes. I'm really cautious about what I'm doing and making sure my kegs are clean.
Yeah, the issue is obviously if you have the bugs can get in your regular beer, and then you get sour regular beer.
Yeah,
or buggy regular beer.
Mark all your kegs, especially the ones that sit.
Mm-hmm. So
once you clean them,
you keep those separate.
Yeah, I'm not too cautious about it. If I was a professional brewer, I would be very more cautious because once the beer leaves your hands, if it sits on a shelf or sits in a keg box somewhere warm, you might have issues. But all my beer, once it's made, sits in a chest freezer, at 35 degrees. So maybe there might be some organisms in a particular beer. I'm never going to know because it got drank within a couple months and it's been sitting at 35. So I would say yes, you need to be cautious, but don't freak out. Don't go buy twice of everything and you're worried about it. Yeah. Mark a tap handle that's going to be your sour beers, and if it's if you only have one and you want to run it through, that's okay. Change the line or just run some PBW, some hot water through it. I think you'll be fine. Just don't put the light lager on that line. So yes and no. There's options. I think you just be cautious. I think at this point, if everybody's made regular beer, they know what the cleaning process is, and just be aware. I pretty much, after I'm done with the beer, I treat every keg like it's infected. It gets cleaned really well. It gets cleaned with 165-degree water, sits there, the PBW, and all that, and then the star sand.
Cleaned and sanitized, yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
I know you mentioned earlier using wood or oak to help aid flavor to the beer or give it some richness, I guess.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you just talk for a minute about how you use those and then what flavors you can get out of that. Because it does have character, particularly your sour beer.
Yeah, we got American oak and French oak, and those are different characters. People prefer either one. Best thing to do is to buy them both and then kind of smell them, maybe make a tea out of them in the microwave, and then kind of smell and taste that flavor and see if you like it. You can blend them. That's usually what I'll do. So it's because most of these beers are obviously blended from multiple barrels on the professional side. Mm-hmm. So that'll give you that kind of character of both French and American. So that's an option. You have obviously the chips, cubes, and then the staves. And then if you want to go full hog, you got a full barrel that you can play with. Most of the time when homebrewers or clubs get a full barrel, you're going to get one that's pretty much, they call a neutral barrel. There's not much oak flavor left in it because that's why they got rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
So you can buy some staves or put a bag of cubes in there, and it's all, I can go from anywhere from quarter ounce to 5 gallons to half an ounce or even less, depending on the beer. So you just got to play with it. So I'm going to tell you to start low, maybe a quarter or even a 0.15, just to be safe, because it's going to sit on those for a long time. And then if it needs more, you can always put more in.
Well, you mentioned also making a tea, right? I've heard of people, making a tea and then adding it to taste. What might be a good option if you haven't played with oak before.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. You can obviously do that. And I've also done the opposite, is made it, boil the cubes in the microwave for a few seconds and then pour the water off and then just throw the cubes in. So you get those really first oak noticeable aromatic properties. You get rid of those. So you give you that little bit of a used older barrel kind of character. Those undertones of the wood without having those really potent aromatic properties. So that's an option too. So you kind of, it's all over the map on what you want. If you want that really pungent oak, go ahead and dump that tea in. If you just want the underlying character of it, I would say dump the water out and just put the cubes or the chips in the beer.
Now, what does that do for a sour beer? What does it do in terms of taste?
It just kind of, just that extra dimension. Most of the fruit lambics that I had just last week were not on any sort of oak, and that Chris Wolowski had a peach lambic with no oak. It was all done in glass and stainless, and it was a fabulous beer. I would have said if you would have put it on oak, it probably would have messed it up because the flavors were so bright and so clean that you wouldn't want to do that. Like a Flanders or an old Brewing or something that's got a lot of dark malts and a lot of character, and you're expecting some of that musty kind of character, I would say, put some oak in it. So,
now you mentioned just a minute ago mixing beers, mixing sour beer with regular beer. How do you do that? How do you decide when it's appropriate to mix, and how do you choose which beers to mix it with?
Actually, the Flanders that I made for the Best of Show just this past couple months ago was actually a blended beer. Then I threw it on in a carboy and added a couple bottles of Russian River Sanctification and a Lost Abbey Red Poppy. And then I put some cherries on it too and some oak. So it was a little bit of everything. It ended up being, it's one of those experiments that I can never reproduce. I took notes on it, but I could make it and it probably wouldn't be the same. And they're almost like vintages, just like wine, because they're so hard to reproduce. You get close, but they just so much things that could go wrong or go right. So I ended up doing, I don't have my notes with me, but it was a little bit of American, we'll say 25% like of American wheat. I have a chest freezer that'll hold 15 5-gallon kegs. So at the end of summer, I have a bunch of kegs that are either a quarter full or half full from just whatever. And I'm like, I need to clean my fridge out, and what am I going to do with them all? So this was the first experiment. So it was like a quarter, 25% like American wheat. It was 25% Bach. What else was in there? Oh, had some Golden Strong in there, like a Belgian Blonde. It was a little bit lighter than a Golden Strong. It was like right in the middle. And then a few other little things that kind of finished it out. So don't be afraid if you got some dry stout or whatever else you want, go have at it. That's, I say, the more the merrier.
Just mix them up.
Yeah. And it's got to taste, and then you kind of taste that beer and you can kind of say, okay, well, that's nice. It could work. It's got a little bit of maltiness there, that bready character that associates with that. And I would say stay away from the IPAs and the pale ales. You can use a lager for some backfill, but I wouldn't go all lager. You kind of keep the alcohol within that, 5.5%, 6%, 5.6 range would be good. You can make them bigger, but I make a lot of Belgian, so I usually have a lot of those on hand. So that keeps the alcohol a little high.
Also mentioned a couple of times throwing in fruit, in the secondary when you throw in the bugs, if you will.
Yeah.
What do you get up by adding fruit?
Obviously you get that little cherry note, and I think that goes right along with the PDO. They blend in together and give you that bright cherry.
Cherry your sort of favorite?
Yeah, it is. And on the West Coast, the easiest cherry is the dark, sweet cherry. Mm-hmm. Obviously on the East Coast, you get the tart, cherries, which when I get those out here, I get them, but they're not as prevalent. But I would say use your local fruit. Everything's good. I've had blueberries. Some of the other things that you need to watch out for fruit, strawberries are tough because there's not much
Not
flavor.
much flavor, yeah.
Yeah. So peach is the same way, but you got to use a lot of it. Blueberries got a lot of tannins in the skin.
Oh, yeah.
So I would say lower the oak down a little bit, or maybe even no oak on the something that has that tannin structure, like a boysenberry.
Apricots taste like peaches, though, when you're done? Something like that.
Yeah, a little bit.
There's one of them has a pretty good, actually ferments out pretty well and gives you a good flavor to it. I thought it was
obviously framboise is a raspberry, which is nice.
Raspberry is a good choice, yeah.
Yeah. Actually, grape's not bad either. Like a white grape.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so just be aware of the tannin structure of the fruit. Also, boysenberry is good too, but I would say, put no oak or very little in a boysenberry or a blueberry, just for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
I've had them with oak, and they're fine too, but just be aware of what you're putting in your beer.
Yeah, the tannins obviously add astringency, right?
Yeah, and if you have with the oak, it has that tannin structure, and you put more tannin structure in there from the fruit skins, it could be too much. If it is, you're still not done. You can make another one a little lighter and use it as a balanced beer. So you can still blend at the end. If you made something and it's not quite right, don't be afraid to blend. Yeah.
Well, that kind of pulls me around to one of the last topics I want to talk about. That was lambic and goose, which kind of pull all these techniques in a pretty complicated fermentation schedule. I was wondering, maybe if you could just walk us through what a lambic looks like in terms of brewing a lambic.
They have high amounts of wheat, and they do a really high temperature mash. So they're like in the 170s, I think that is. Mm-hmm. And then I've only done it one time. And then what they're looking for is a lot of tannin structure. You're pulling a lot of tannins out of the husks because that gives all of that bacteria a long time to chew on and turn them over to something. And then you'll hear the term of using old hops. You're not looking for any of the aromatics and the great smells that we're used to with all these great IPAs now. All they want is the bittering and some of the properties of the hops, not necessarily because these beers are going to sit for so long.
They use stale hops, is what I've heard. Anyways.
Yeah, stale hops.
Which are the ones you left laying around in your basement, I guess, for a while or something.
If you ever smelled them, they're all cheesy and they're not something that you would want to add in the beer. I don't know whoever figured that out, but it's like we can't throw them out, so we're just going to throw them in the beer and see what happens. And you're starting
with a fairly regular beer, high mash temperature, but old hops.
Yeah, a lot of wheat. It's pretty much a pale or yellow. There's not much specialty malts on like a regular. And then they'll just pitch. You can do spontaneous, like you mentioned. Just leave they have what's called cool ships. I think Russian River has one, and I don't think it's. Who's the one back in Maine? They just built one. I don't know if it's Ommegang or Avery. I think Avery. Anyways, I say it's not coming to me. But I would say always look on YouTube if you want to find something out. They're pretty neat. So they put it in this big, giant, long vat and let it cool naturally out in the open. Mm-hmm. And from the forest or the orchards, the wild yeast blow in and the bacteria, and then it fermentates that way. We can easily shorten that up by just getting a package of the Roselaire blend and pitch that, and it has all that stuff in it. And it's pretty much reproducible because you're pitching the same stuff all the time.
So do you pitch the fruit in at the same time, or are you doing that later?
That would be later.
Obviously, it's cherry lambics and all the other different...
Yeah, that would probably be later because of the fact that you want it to age for a length of time. Usually a goose is a blend of a 1 year, a 2 year, and a 3 year old lambic. So they all have their own characters. And I haven't been over to Cantillon, but there's been friends of mine that have been over there and tasted each individual one. Mm-hmm. And they're interesting. And then once the art of blending is done, it's amazing. Something that wasn't there is there. And that's the art of blending. And that's why you hear about winemakers it's just like one of those great things that happens.
Okay, so they ferment. They're really fermenting with bugs. They're not really throwing in traditional brewer's yeast, right?
Yep.
And they let that go for how long before tossing in the fruit? You know,
I would say at least a year.
Wow.
Taste it to see if it's where you want it. If it's not, just wait. And then you can put it on fruit. It could be a couple months. It could be another 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I do my pitch the cherries, I'll just let them sit on there. It could be a year, 2 years. I don't take them back off.
Mm-hmm.
They just stay in there. So at that point, just let them stay in there and let them go.
And then some number of years later, you decide to finally drink it, right?
Yep. When you finally decide that, I've had ones that have been done in 6 months. Not a huge sour Brett character. Noticeable. Very nice beer. Really mild sour. Really, I would say that would be an easy one. 6 months is not too long. And see if it has enough character to it that you can say, it's still a beer, but you can tell something else. Some of the Brett and some of the Pedococcus and all those other organisms have taken hold and have some character. And bottle it up and then let it sit and then have one every couple weeks, couple months. Yeah.
Very cool.
I have them. I make a lot of sours, but I don't come home and that's not my go-to beer. It's obviously something lighter, pale ale or an IPA, just like everybody else. But when you have friends over, special occasions, end of the night thing, it's kind of like as beer drinkers, we don't have cigars, we have sours. And that's kind of how it ends up. So. And the wine drinkers have cigars, ruin their palate, and we just have the sour beers that ruin our palate. So it seems to be the idea. So,
well, Mike, is there anything else you'd like to add? Is there anything we missed?
I would say try it. If you don't like it, let it sit. Just make if you got some beer sitting around in the kegs at the end of summer that you don't know what you're going to do with, make a beer that you think would work as a blend if you don't have enough and try it out. There's always 3-gallon carboys too. If you don't have enough to make a 5-gallon one, get a 3-gallon. And I would say fill it all the way to the top. Maybe leave like an inch or 2 inches. You don't want as much headspace. Keep the oxygen pickup as small as possible. Put your local fruit in there. Put what you like. If you do like strawberries, just remember you're not going to get much out of it if you put it in a darker beer. If you like boysenberries, be cautious on the tannins of those. Obviously, the go-to ones are obviously cherries, creeks, and then you have the framboise, which is raspberries. There's a reason why they're out there popular because those are the acidity level works with the beer. Both those fruits are acidic. You can still taste them, and they're really nice. So
I think if you go to the BeerSmith blog, I've got an article on fruit beer brewing, and it mentions different characters of fruits and what some of the better ones are that go in beer. Because as you point out, some fruits taste great, but when you put them in beer, they really just don't generate any real flavor. I wanted to make a strawberry blonde ale, and it just never seemed to be right. There's no strawberry just doesn't give you enough. It tends to ferment out pretty well.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mike. I really appreciate you being on the show.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed seeing you at the conference. So it was nice hanging out.
Yeah, that was a great conference. Oh, you know what else I want to ask you real quick? Maybe because a lot of people haven't had good sour beer.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could just mention a couple commercial beers that people might easily be able to find that have sour notes in them.
Obviously, Cantillon's on the far end of the scale, but if you can get that,
fairly expensive.
Hard to get. Yeah, but how much would somebody pay for a bottle of wine? Normal people, $30 is not a big deal to spend on a diced bottle of wine. But when it comes to beer, $30 is, to me, I'm not going to have it every night if I buy one. It's some special occasion. So don't be afraid to drop a little bit of extra money. Just have somebody else there to share it with and bounce ideas.
Absolutely.
Usually somebody that's experienced in that style of beer and you're tasting all these weird flavors that you can ask questions about would probably be a good place to start. Probably.
What about some domestic ones?
Yeah, domestic ones.
Sours.
We have Jolly Pumpkin, not too sour, more beer structure to it, still a beer, but has those notes in there. Those are really nice. Obviously, Russian Rivers, they got Sanctification, Temptation, all those are really nice. Lost Abbey has a few. quite a few selection. I like their red poppy, and they're getting more popular. There's a lot around the country. There's Cascadia that is very more popular. I heard a lot of people talking about it at the conference up in Oregon, I think. So you just got to search them out, ask some questions, check some blogs, say, hey, I heard of something local, give me some feedback on it. There's so much going on right now. It's hard to stay on top of it. I can talk about local stuff, but I know there's a lot of other people out there. Even where you live, the craft beer.
The local supermarket now has a specialty section. It was just a little small section set off, actually away from the main beers, where they've got the single bottles of exotic stuff, and they've got some great stuff there. Fantastic.
So Hansen's another. So don't be afraid to try one. If I would say buy the smaller ones and split it with somebody. That's the first place to start, and then save that. When you make the beer and use that beer to dump into something, and you don't have to worry about buying any of the yeast and have at it. But it's a good time. It's good stuff.
Well, thank you again, Mike. I really appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you.
Great to have you. Once again, that was Mike Mraz. He's 2008, 2009 California Homebrewer of the Year, third place in the Pale Ale category at the national level this year, and he's a regular guest on Can You Brew It? Well, I'd like to give a big thank you again to Mike Mraz for being on the show. He did a great job with that sour beer brewing. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.